I'm back and am excited about some of the things the Lord showed me recently, and also some of the things He wants me to come in and discuss with you guys. Recently, I took a class on hermeneutics, and the Lord really just opened up my eyes to understanding better ways to explain how I study the scriptures, and also the right research methods and different things like that. So I just want to have a discussion about those things. Um, my channel is going to continue to develop. I am an entrepreneur, husband, father, very busy person. So um, I'm not looking for perfection. That's not my goal. My goal is not to be able to, have these conversations and make sure everything is perfect and the perfect lighting and the perfect. I just don't have the time for it. But I do have a calling and a purpose to be able to continue to share. So the more interaction you guys give along the way, comments or whatever it may be, whether it's in a live or later on, the more I can give to you guys. But overall, I'm gonna do this unto the Lord, and hopefully, we'll develop a appropriate relationship when it comes to that. Um, and I'll be able to figure out how to give you guys what you need. All right, so what I want to talk about today is one of the research methods. It's a point of view. It's a perspective. It's a way to look at this at studying, right? It's a way to approach studying, right? Um, give you an example, right? If you go to seminary school or talk to a preacher that's been in seminary school, um, they have a perspective. Not all, but some have a perspective where whenever you look at the Old Testament, you're supposed to look at it from a point of view of seeing Christ in the scriptures, in every single scripture that you see. And the hermeneutics class that I was taking, they brought that up. Now, from my point of view, there's another thing. That's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today, called critical interpretation. So critical interpretation is kind of different when it comes to that, right? And I'll tell you the what these things mean, but I'm also going to break down specifically talking about critical interpretation. But and I hope I'm saying it right. I think it's Christology. The concept of Christology is everything in the Old Testament is alluding to Christ. You just have to find it in the scripture. So if you see a scripture, easy example is tithes, right? So you look at tithes and it starts to talk about tithes. You're supposed to see the scripture as how is this being interpreted to talk about Christ. That's how it's looked at, right? And that's one method of looking at the scriptures. Another method of looking at the scriptures, which is more my preference, is called critical interpretation. And before I say that, it's not that I'm saying that method is wrong, because there's plenty of scriptures that you do see that things happen in the Old Testament, and talked, it's mentioned as an example to bring up something about Christ in the New Testament. So that's where you see that it's perfectly applicable and it should be done. But I think what happens is people go get extreme and they say, well, every scripture you see, you should see it this way. And I'm going to, again, explain my position of why I don't see it that way. Critical interpretation, though, is when you're looking at a scripture and you're really looking at it for what it says and what it means from the original author to the original reader. And in that arc of understanding what did it originally mean, you find out the one and only meaning. And then after you get that meaning, it may have multiple different applications, right? As a father, it may hit different than, let's say, my son. He's not a father. So he may read a scripture about a father and it's not going to resonate with him the same way because he's not a father yet, right? He's in a different place. He may, if there's a scripture that's talking about both fathers and sons or whatever it may be, we're going to naturally hone in on, okay, this is the part that's applicable to me, right? But that's how we look at it. We find out the meaning, we understand the meaning, and then we draw out the meaning, and then boom, and then that's when we can teach it or explain or have conversation about it. That's how that works. Perfect example of that is the scripture that talks about it's easier For a rich man, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, right? If you look at that from the wrong point of view, then you're going to say, oh, okay, it's talking about needle and thread, right? You're going to look at it from an American point of view versus looking at it from a critical interpretation. And that's some of the processes we're going to go through. You'll look at it culturally, and you'll find out that an eye of a needle at that particular time was like a doorway. And it was a tight doorway, and it'd be hard for a camel to fit through there. And that's using critical interpretation. So, again, there are scriptures where you're going to see you use critical interpretation to fully understand the meaning of the text, and then it will connect to Christology. And you'll see a New Testament scripture that says that happens. So it's not a right or wrong situation, but I think it should always start off with critical interpretation. So let's talk about what it is. And if you have any questions or comments about that, feel free to throw it down below, and I will answer whatever those questions are. So, critical interpretation. So it's two terms you have to understand to start off, right? It's almost like a tree. We start off with critical interpretation. I told you essentially what it is. You got to understand this term called exegesis. Okay? So exegesis is when we are looking at the text and we are going to understand and interpret the text according to what is there. Right? And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to identify and observe as much information as we can that's there. But it has to start with what's there. Versus the other term called exegesis. What exegesis means is where you are inserting something into the text. Remember our example of tithes. Okay, if I'm studying the topic of tithing, and I'm using the strategy of exegesis, then I'm going to look at what's there. What you'll find is that there was a tithing cycle. Depending on, if you're looking at it from a Jewish point of view and Jewish interpretation, you'll see that there was a tithe, and then you'll see that there was two other tithes that would rotate. So one was going to the Levites, and then you'll see the one where it says to take it and eat it in the presence of the Lord. You'll see the other one on another cycle, another timeline, where it talks about giving it to, they call it the poor tithe, giving it to the fatherless, the widows, the foreigners, as well as to the Levites. You'll see that it was specifically supposed to be given to the Levites because, and this is all scripture, this is all 100% scripture, because they were not receive a part of the inheritance when they entered into the promised land, right? So you'll see all these other details of information because you're examining what's there, versus somebody who would be looking at it from a perspective of exegesis. They would read a scripture and then they would insert our cultural norms, insert their perspective. Like, to give you an example, bring all the tithes into the storehouse. There may be meat in my house, right? If I'm inserting into the text, what I'm saying is bring you all the tithes to the storehouse. Now I'm like, oh, that means church. When it does not mean church. Hey, how's it going? It does not mean church. We're talking about that time, the temple, when that scripture was written, right? So, into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. Again, if I'm doing eisegesis, I will insert into the text, oh, that there may be meat in my house. That's talking about money. Versus if I'm looking at it literally from the text, then that's when you're going to find and be like, oh, no, it's talking about food, meat, right? And then there'll be 100 other scriptures that will align with that if we're looking at it from the right term, from the right point of view. So you start off with a critical interpretation, and then you go into exegesis, and then we break into what exactly is exegesis. So it's two things we're going to look at as we go into from exegesis to the two different things. One is two different research methods. It's historical grammatical interpretation, and I'm going to break down what that is, and then literary analysis. Don't worry about the terms per se. All these things are Googleables. You can always watch this back and replay it, and then write it down, and and get busy like that. But the main thing is the concepts that you really want to be applying when you're studying a particular scripture. And because I already started talking about tithes, we'll keep that as our example, right? Um, so let's start off with the first one: historical grammatical interpretation. So historical. In the historical, I'm looking at it from now a historical context. So you're looking at the time. I'm looking at the time that this particular scripture took place in, right? So if you were doing, again, a study of tithes, you can go all the way back with Jacob when he said he was going to give a tenth. You can go back to Abraham when he gave a tenth to Melchizedek. It really was. It's funny because it really wasn't. It wasn't his what he gave. It's kind of funny when you really break it down. Looking at it literally, he gave a tenth of somebody else's stuff. But spoils of war, so that's how it kind of worked. Um, then you have other details. The law, which the law is the one that everybody's generally kind of talking about in particular, or whatever. So these are all different timelines that you can look at it in whatever the scripture in. You want to make sure that you're looking at it properly. You don't want to look at the scripture about tithing in the law as the same as you look at the one Abraham, right? That's we're inserting something into the text now. Like it's not because they said the word tithing, it's all the same, right? You have to examine it. Was it the same in this timeline? Was it the same in this timeline? Was it the same in this timeline? And what you'll find is, again, Abraham, totally different. Um, Jacob, totally different. The law, the same. And then it kind of goes out from there. Um, oops, excuse me. um, Another thing is setting. What's going on around that time? What's going on, Eric? Was dealing with the setting. What exactly was happening around that time when these particular ones? So let's just focus on the law one, right? Just so that we can be in unison about exactly what we're talking about, using this, historical grammatical concept or whatever. So if I'm looking at the setting specifically around tithing, I know at this particular time they're being given instructions. What else is important to the setting is the instruction to give the tithe specifically to the Levites. What's the setting? How would that be? How would we be able to focus on what's going on? Well, they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And when they go into the promised land, the Levites are not going to receive inheritance. This is all scripture that breaks all of this down. This is the setting of the situation. The setting is going to provide context to the situation. Why the Levites? Why does the Levite only get a tithe? Right? We get to break it all the way down and understand it. And while we're looking at it from this point of view of critical interpretation, right? So that's something that we would want to know about where they're at. They're in the wilderness. They're getting ready into the promised land. This is all details that are critical with understanding this particular perspective, right? And then you can go into culture. That's another one. So time, setting, culture. This is all looking at the historical side of it. So now culture, right? There are other cultures that had some type of tithing system. You might say, well, how do you know that? Okay. Well, the law talked about tithing, right, during that situation, but we also saw it happen with Abraham. We also saw it happen with Jacob. So pre-law, before it was a law, before God passed down a law in order to do this specifically to Levites, because it's done a totally different way, a very specific way, with tithing cycles and instructions and all kind of other stuff. The scriptures even talk about a tithe of a tithe from the Levite to the Aaronic priesthood. All of this is relevant, and what you could do is do a cultural search of other customs at that particular time frame that also did tithing. You can compare and contrast. Did they all belong to priests? Did maybe they belong to some kings? Maybe they belong. These are all important details, and it will help you to appreciate the detail that you are already handling, which has to do with culture, which has to do with the Jews, what has to do with what the specific instructions were for them, right? So that's the historical side for historical grammatical interpretation. The grammatical side, you want to look at how the language is being used, right? I think a good example of that, if you read the scripture, Ephesians 4:11, and that whole text, I think it's like down to like 16, talks about what the gifts are, and then it starts to break down, um, what their purpose is and what they're supposed to be used for, and you're gonna see a rhythm if you're reading it of how it's structured. You're gonna see this theme of maturity, how we're supposed to be grow into a mature man, and then later on it goes on to say not being children anymore, tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. And if you start looking into some of the words in there, it's also going to give you this example, this idea of how, like it says, growing to the full stature of Christ. It's not talking about height, it's talking about stability. Stability also connects to maturity. So you can read the scripture and start to see, oh wow, there's a rhythm here, there's a pattern here, and that's the grammatical side. That's what you're going to be looking for. You're also going to be looking for certain words. What did this Greek word mean? What this Hebrew word mean? You know, is there more information in there to be pulled out while I'm reading the scripture? There are certain scriptures that talk about the apostles, and that same word apostle is translated messenger in other scriptures. So while you're studying, you can see, oh wow, there's more information here. Again, if you're using this perspective. So again, you got historical grammatical interpretation, which again in the grammatical side, you're looking at context, meanings of words, sentence structure. These are all things that are going to help you get a clearer perspective and a clearer meaning of what this scripture means. The other part of exegesis, right? Because that's the historical grammatical. We just talked about that. The other part is the literary analysis, right? So what is that talking about? We could be looking at the genre of the book. What kind of book is this? Going back to our tithing example, in the law, we all know the law was very literal, right? You don't do one, you don't do them all. It was very specific. God told Moses, build according to pattern. Like, it was very like boom, boom, boom. People supposed to do this or not supposed to do that. It was very, very, very specific. So when we are looking at the same conversation centered around tithing, and we know the style of book that Deuteronomy is, that Leviticus is, that Numbers is, right? These books that we're seeing, all of the Exodus is, we're seeing the law brought in and seeing these scriptures that have to do with the law. I know the style of book is very literal, therefore I'm gonna take it literally. So when they say the Levites are supposed to receive this in lieu of an inheritance, as their inheritance, that's literal. It's not something that we can take in and come in and do eisegesis and say, well, I'm gonna trade. How about I trade you your Levite for my? I'm gonna insert pastor there, and then the tither, I'm gonna insert myself there when it was applied to the Jews, right? So you can't. It's gonna get real dicey of understanding the original interpretation, so that we can take it out and say, okay, what does this mean to me? It's going to get real dicey, right? I'll give you a perfect example of that. Why it's going to get dicey? We know that the scriptures talk about in the law that the priesthood was the Levitical priesthood. It was also the Aaronic priesthood, right? This was their priesthood. I can check my computer, see if I get an exact scripture, but there is a scripture in the New Testament that talks about Jesus being a priest by the order, and I'm typing it down here, of Melchizedek. There we go. I'm gonna pull up the scripture so I can say it specifically. Hebrews, like Hebrews 7. Seven 17. Let me read that. Looks like all of 7 is really good. I'll start at 8. The priests who collected tithes are men who die. So Melchizedek is greater than they are, because we are told that he lives on. In addition, we might even say that these Levites, the ones who collected the tithe, right? Again, it's the same thing. paid to him. Wait, let me see. Collected the tithe, paid a tithe to Melchizedek when their ancestor Abraham paid a tithe to him. For although Levi wasn't born yet, the seed from which he came was in Abraham's body, and Melchizedek collected a tithe from him. So in the law, specifically talking about the law, the tithe given to Levites. But then it's saying, as an analogy, Levi, in an analogy way, paid a tithe to Melchizedek, a whole separate priesthood. In fact, there's a part in here I want to get to. Okay, here we go. 15. The change has been made very clear since a different priest, who is like Melchizedek, has appeared. Jesus became a priest not by meeting the physical requirements of belonging to the tribe of Levi, because again, remember, the law is very literal. You can't just be a priest just because you want to be. You had to be from the tribe of Levi. So it's a literal book. But by the power of the life that cannot be destroyed. And the psalmist pointed this out when he prophesied, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Yes, the old requirement about the priesthood was set aside because it was weak and useless. For the law never made anything perfect. But now we have confidence in a better hope. I'm trying to find the part that talks about there we go. 24. But Jesus lives forever. His priesthood lasts forever. So again, it's gonna you keep reading that, you're gonna see that Jesus became our high priest, not by and through the law, but separate from it. So you see the analogy is it wouldn't be appropriate to say, oh yeah, I'm pastor, so therefore I'm gonna replace the Levite in this situation. When we're seeing the analogy right here, we're seeing the Levite is used, and they were like, hey, we got a new high priest, which the high priest would have been the Aaronic priesthood, would have been Aaron. And it mentions Aaron earlier in the scripture. So if the priesthood of Levi on which the law was based could have achieved the perfection God intended, why did God need to establish a different priesthood with a priest in the order of Melchizedek instead of the order of Levi and Aaron? And if the priesthood is changed, the law must also be changed to permit it. So again, it leaves this example where it's showing us, hey, Jesus is our high priest now, not my pastor. Doesn't fit. But that, again, that's using critical interpretation. So me looking at the genre of the book, another quick example of the literary analysis, look at the book of Proverbs. Let me go there real quick. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 6. This is a perfect example in my opinion. And then I have one more thing for you guys, and then we'll probably shut it down. Let me go there real quick. Proverbs chapter 1. This is a perfect example of literary analysis. Hey, Zaba. Good to see you, man. This is a perfect... Zava hopping in. Definitely watch it back when you get an opportunity. But what we're talking about is basically how to study the Bible using a concept called critical interpretation. And why critical interpretation is important. So Proverbs 1 and 6 says, by exploring the meaning of these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise... In fact, let me go back to 5. Actually, 4. These proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. Let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those with understanding receive guidance. By exploring the meaning of these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise and their riddles, that tells us what Proverbs is going to be like. It's going to be proverbs, parables, and words of the wise and their riddles. That's what we're going to have to do in the book of Proverbs. So it's already telling us the kind of book that we're in. So if I'm dealing with riddles, that means while I'm reading Proverbs, I can't take the scripture literally. That's not how you would read it. It's like poetry. That's the style of book Proverbs is. So you have to be careful of some of the doctrines that may develop by reading one scripture and saying, oh, and then I'll quote the scripture, but it didn't interpret the meaning of the scripture, it took it quite literally. So that's an example of literary analysis. Let me say this last thing, and then I'll shut it down. In regards to what I said earlier, looking at things from critical interpretation versus and we're talking about the Old Testament in particular. Critical interpretation versus Christology. Christology meaning every scripture I see, I have to find Jesus in the scripture. Versus another method of critical interpretation, looking at it for what the scripture meant from the original author to the original reader, understanding what it means, and then drawing out the meaning from there and seeing how it's applicable, to us then. I want to show you why my stance is firmly on that. It's 2 Timothy 3:16. And I'm going to show you the difference. And I know that there's other people who believe different, who think different, they teach different. And I'm not one that's going to create world war or civil war within the Christian community. I don't believe in that. There are plenty of scriptures that start off with critical interpretation, and then the New Testament will show Christology. It'll show how they found Jesus in that particular text, and I'm all for that. And I think that's good. I just don't think it's supposed to be every single scripture, because I haven't found a scripture that says every single scripture that's how we're supposed to look at it from that point of view. In fact, this is what I have found. This is 3:16. All scripture. Now, when they send all scripture, take this into consideration. At that particular time, the books that they had was Old Testament, right? So a lot of times when they're saying all scripture, they're referencing the Old Testament. All scripture is inspired by God and is useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what is wrong in our lives. It corrects us when we are wrong and teaches us to do what is right. God uses this to prepare and equip his people to do every good work. Let's break that down. Again, looking at a point of view from just Christology, I'm only looking at it from that point of view. And please, if somebody, kind of goes by that concept, feel free, as long as it's not in a hostile way, to give me your perspective if you have it. There's no beef. I don't believe in that. But if my understanding, looking at it from that point of view, if I'm looking at, say, a scripture in Proverbs, speak not every fool, the way I heard it explained is somebody would say, well, I'm going to find Jesus in that scripture, and I'm going to say, speak not every fool, it's talking about Jesus. And it's talking about, here's an example where he did that, or whatever. Versus, this is my point of view. Let me get back to 2 Timothy 3:16. All scripture is inspired by God and is useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what's wrong in our lives. Let's start off with that. If I am somebody who constantly is getting into arguments with people, with God's people, as God-fearing man, the scripture is saying, hey, this is going to teach me what's wrong in my life. Hey, man, all this contention that you keep having, you got to make that adjustment. In fact, I heard it explained, somebody said, well, that's moralism, meaning you're trying to teach people to do good, do better. Don't teach like do better. Scriptures. And again, to me, this scripture clearly is kind of going against that. And I think it's important to bring that up. But it's useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what's wrong in our lives. So the scriptures are going to show us what's wrong in our lives, right? It corrects us when we are wrong and teaches us to do what is right. So we are supposed to look at it from a point of view of, I can do better. It's because the scriptures are going to literally teach me what is wrong and correct me and tell me what is right. The scriptures are useful for that purpose, right? So if we're just looking at it just only from the point of view of, like a scripture like a good man leaves an inheritance to his children. That's about fiscal responsibility, right? That's about being responsible with your money. That's about making sure you have something to pass down to your seeds later on. If I'm only looking at that from from Christology, then I'm trying to find where Jesus is in that scripture, and I can miss the part that's talking about fiscal responsibility. I'm gonna miss it. It also says God uses it to prepare and equip his people for every good work. Again, there's plenty of scriptures in the Old Testament using the example of somebody being argumentative, right? Plenty scriptures that will show me, hey man, be slow to speak, be quick to listen. Do not befriend an angry man. There's all kind of different things that are going to show you, hey, make the adjustment, because that's part of walking by faith. Faith without works is dead, being alone. You need the works to go with with the faith to validate the faith. Faith without works is dead, being alone. So they go together. And that's the thing that I wanted to come on here and as I'm talking about critical interpretation, I wanted to bring, a little bit of insight to that. Christology is good when the scripture does it, in my opinion. And there's other scriptures that it can be pretty clear that, okay, yeah, I see how this connects to Christ. But even in that, I think it's important not just to teach the Old Testament from that point of view only, because I think you're going to miss so much. You have to start off with critical interpretation, understand what the scripture meant from the original author to the original reader. And then once you understand that truth, then we can walk from there. And if you do that, you will avoid a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpreting of the scriptures. You'll also avoid eisegesis, inserting stuff into the text, which ultimately is going to have you misinterpret the scripture. And, a lot of times you'll see the fruit in that. You'll see people's perspectives and their attitudes and their anger. Is this a particular doctrine adding fear? Is it putting on a heavy fear? That kind of thing. So I've been here long enough, y'all. 30 minutes. That's a lot longer than I thought I was going to be here. This is critical interpretation. I think this is a very, very good way to study the scriptures. It'll give you'll be very, very thorough in your understanding of the scriptures. And to be honest with you, it'll help mature you and not be blown to and fro by every wind of doctrine, because you'll be completely thorough and understand what the scriptures meant to the original, from the original writer to the original reader. And, you won't take a lot of that good stuff for granted. If anybody has any questions, I'll answer those now. If not, man, appreciate you guys, for the guys and gals or whoever that stuck around, people who watched the replay. Again, appreciate it. My goal here on this channel, I want to start teaching more about how to teach. I geek out over this stuff. I really enjoy it. So I want to get into some of those nuances of what's the best way to interpret scriptures. What are some of the other research methods? Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that next time. Can you start anywhere? In my opinion, yeah, why not? I know. So you'll have people generally say, "Hey, man, start in the Gospels." They'll tell you that, right? And excuse me. For the most part, I understand why they say that, but when my father got me started in the scripture, he told me to start in Proverbs, and that's where I started. And I was just stunned. I was shocked at how much information was in the Bible about everyday life, about living everyday life. And it really gave me a really good foundation for understanding that I have to do this thing. I have to be a doer of the word, not just a hearer of the word. So my kids are kind of getting started, really, really studying the scriptures. So I'm kind of teaching them some of the stuff that we're talking about now. And what I tell them is grab a concordance, and I would start with topics that you're interested in. That's more of the studying side. But even more important than studying is reading. Because sometimes you'll just be familiar with a scripture because you've heard about it before. You read David and Goliath, and if you've never read it, on your own, you'll see that he actually cut Goliath's head off. You'll see in his arc of story, he actually gets Goliath's sword back, and he goes into a temple and they have it there, and he takes it with him. You'll see that he took the head of Goliath to Saul. You'll see a lot of really cool, interesting things that maybe are not a part of the Disney version of what the scriptures say or whatever, and it'll add so much more context and so much realness to it. And those are called narratives when you're kind of reading this, like somebody's story or storyline or whatever. So that's what I would do. I would start where you're interested. I wouldn't focus 100% on studying as much as I would read first so that you can understand the context from beginning to end per book. Like I remember reading the New Testament from Acts all the way to I think like Jude. Like I stopped there, and it gave me pretty good context of okay. And I kept seeing this repeat theme called love and how important love was to God, versus just homing in on one verse and saying no 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 no, no and that's what we're gonna focus on. It gives you a better perspective. So I would say just read, start off reading, and then you're gonna eventually come through certain scriptures. And like I was telling my daughter, eventually you're gonna read and it's gonna be a little bit hard to understand because you have to go back and read Old Testament stuff to understand. Like Hebrews is a good example of that. You're talking about all of these concepts to the bigger picture, and in order to understand what they're saying, you got to know a little bit of what they're talking about. What is the tabernacle? Like we just read scripture earlier about the Levites. What is that? So you'll get into all of that later. But if you just start reading first, I think it's a good place to start. It's just read where you're interested. Eric says I started in Matthew. Again, and that's very 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 common. A lot of people say that. Definitely nothing wrong with that. You get because then you'll start with okay. I'm reading and I'm the same way I was saying how Goliath got his head cut off. And David cut Goliath's head off, and he held it over, and eventually he had the sword of Goliath and all that kind of cool little details or whatever. It'd be the same way for you with Jesus if you start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you'll see these different perspectives on this same story. So that's really good. And over time, like I said, you'll come across certain topics, and you'll be like, "Wow, this is interesting. Let me I want to know more about that." And I had to spend a season to study the tabernacle, and study the temple, and all of this stuff comes over time. I've been doing this since I was 19. I'll be 39 in 5 days. So this is 20 years in. So it will take time. But I hope that answered the questions, Alvin. All right. If there's no more, man, guys, I appreciate you guys. Thank you, Zava, for hanging around. Thank you, Eric, for hanging around. Anybody else that popped in, popped out, anybody who watched the replay, man, appreciate you guys. And like I said, I'm gonna keep trying to do way more teaching, and these are going to be the methods. You're going to see me doing a lot of critical interpretation and really honing in and teaching you how to study while I'm studying, while we talk about these particular topics. All right. And if you have any areas or questions that you may have, please feel free to put them down there. It doesn't matter the question. I believe God is going in the right time and give a really good solid answer. But it'll be from this method. I want you to know where did where did Tay get this idea for you? What is his method? How is he studying the scripture? How is he coming up with these answers? I just gave it to you. Critical interpretation. All right. God bless you guys, man. And I will see you guys. Now, I'm not sure if it's what rate I'm gonna be doing this at. Is it gonna be a couple times a week, one day a week, a couple times bi-weekly? Not sure. I'm gonna just keep being led, keep studying, keep having fun studying, and then when I get an opportunity to hop on and talk. So if you guys miss a live, just just watch the replay and comment to me, and I'll definitely interact with you every time, man. God bless you guys. I will see you guys on the next one.